This is the time a civilization has before it dies, and it was 250 years before China's civilization died. China's fall came in the period known as the Century of Humiliation, a time when China was attacked by the British, French, Japanese and Russians, putting China's civilization to shame. As Chinese civilization crumbled, the population would face the consequences, and so after countless wars, China would plan its vengeance. In this time, Mao Zedong rose to power, becoming leader and founder of the CCP, and was obsessed with taking over the world. Mao's China was still dirt poor, his vision in ruins, and untold millions were dead after the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, so how would a poverty-stricken third world country go on to take over the world? Money. But it was a catch-22. If you have to become a free market democracy to get the money, then you've abandoned the political power the money was supposed to preserve. How do you break the Gordian knot, thread the needle? China had to somehow be the richest nation in the world without a free market economy. For some inspiration, China looked to the US and USSR. China saw that money turned the US into a global superpower, and how micromanaging everything destroyed the Soviet Union. So China took the best of both worlds, combining authoritarianism with a hint of capitalism to make the money they needed for world domination. And so the Chinese state was run as a business, doing whatever it took to reach its goals of maximum economic efficiency. China would make companies do whatever the state said, with no care for the consequences.
It's the people of the United States who are the victims of what amounts to Chinese theft on a scale so massive that it represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history. If you're an American adult, it is more likely than not that China has stolen your personal data.
China has a population of around 1.4 billion people, and the majority of them are now joining an explosive middle class, demanding their share of all that good stuff: infrastructure, the clothes, the cars, the gas to fuel them, the wealth, with all of this leading to growing appetites. Which meant China would have to come up with a way of fulfilling these appetites, these dreams and aspirations. And so it quickly became obvious that China would have to rebuild the Silk Road, all of which led to the development of the Belt and Road Initiative, a historic plan to make it easier for anyone to trade with China through railways, highways, electric grids, seaports, and accessing Europe through the Arctic in less than an hour. But to achieve this, China would have to partner with nearly 70 countries, and most of these countries happen to be quite hostile to the West. Pakistan, Russia, you name it. And here's one of the most cringy Chinese propaganda videos to explain it. But again, it didn't take long for China to run into another problem. The original Silk Road that connects China with the rest of the world runs through an area of China called Xingjang, China's gateway into the Western world by land. If Xinjiang isn't controlled, then world domination would just remain a pipe dream. Xinjiang is also a goldmine of natural resources that China desperately needs. It's home to 40% of China's coal reserves and 25% of China's gas reserves. So in a way, Xinjiang is China's most important piece of land. However, unlike the majority of China, Xinjiang is home to an ethnic Muslim minority called the Uyghurs. They look different from the main ethnic Han group, who account for 90% of China's population. The Uyghurs speak a different language than the rest of China, but most importantly, they have a completely different culture. Their culture is more similar to the neighbouring Turkish countries than to the Chinese, which is not good, because the next step in China's plans for world domination relies on extreme population control. So if there's anyone who happens to be thinking outside of the CCP's culture, let alone an entire people's, then that will ruin both the economic and societal foundations needed for world domination. So what was the solution?
The Chinese government has sent more than 1 million Uyghurs, a Muslim minority ethnic group, to centers like this for what it calls voluntary job training. US officials have previously described them as concentration camps.
So first, China would slowly introduce Han Chinese to the region over several decades, until the Han Chinese population equaled the Uyghur population. And then over time, China would give the jobs, houses, and better quality of life to the Han rather than the Uyghurs. And so as China wanted, the Uyghurs retaliated in anger, protesting, rioting, and disorder. It was perfect. In the words of the Chinese government, if trust is broken in one place, restrictions are imposed everywhere. China would have a reason to test its new surveillance technology. Religious extremist rioting? What better excuse than to deploy the area with swarms of police and 24-hour surveillance, put police stations, police cars, and armored vehicles around every corner and exhaust everyone by creating mandatory security checkpoints for every aspect of daily life, so that to be in Xinjiang means being checked every day, multiple times a day, when you go to the market, when you drive a car, and when you take a train. And all of this technology and surveillance allowed China to experiment with its new ideas for population control. It was an early stage social credit system. So by having all of this crazy control, China was able to use this to categorize people as safe or unsafe. Once the CCP categorizes people, they then have an excuse to get rid of all these unsafe people walking around. It's their solution to terrorism, because they could then round up all these unsafe people and dump them in a vocational center, or what the US Defense Department calls concentration camps.
Activists say Beijing has done that to try to eliminate Islam within its borders. And ex-detainees have told CNN they were tortured inside while undergoing political indoctrination.
Many in these camps often die through starvation and have their organs harvested to pay for the camps. But before they die, China would have to re-educate them, use these people as slave labor for the Silk Road. China takes all these Uyghurs into these brainwashing classrooms where they teach them to be obedient citizens. These Uyghurs are then left in rooms with tens of people cramped up together with only one toilet, so that feces and excrement pile up. Also, that disease and exhaust will remove the weak without a bullet being wasted. But of course the international community would have some questions, so China would select a few actors in their model camps, meaning that when journalists started to ask some serious questions, they'll have nothing to criticize.
As hundreds of thousands of Muslims disappear into giant secure facilities, China has begun taking a few selected journalists inside. This is what it wants the world to see. Offered up as proof that these are not prisoners, but students. Willingly being guided away from extremism.
First, there's no so-called genocide or forced labor or mass sterilization or other things. We call it the lies of the century.
For the first time, 4 Chinese officials, one organisation, named, shamed and sanctioned for their parts in the treatment of the Uyghurs, in a move coordinated with the European Union, the US and Canada.
China never cared about this, they knew this would happen, and they continued with their plans for world domination. So by using these concentration camps, China was able to both gain free slave labour, full control of Xingjang, and develop a social credit system. A national system in China where you have a certain amount of points depending on your actions. Behaviour leading to a deduction in credit will include jaywalking. Bad driving, smoking on trains.
Dear passengers, people who travel without tickets or behave disorderly or smoking public areas will be punished according to regulations, and the behavior will be recorded in the individual credit information system. To avoid any negative record of personal credit, please follow the relevant regulations.
Buying too many video games, buying too much junk food, buying too much alcohol, calling a friend online who has a low social credit score, merely having a friend online who has a low social credit score, posting fake news online, critiquing the government, visiting unauthorized websites, walking a dog without a leash, and letting your dog bark too much. Low-ranked citizens will then be prevented from taking buses, planes, and trains. Even buying fuel for your car, property, everything.
我现在是已经被限制这个自由的出行了，就是订票啊，我们高铁和飞机都不行。我跟你演示一下，我们用这个 APP 来订票。现在是我们从重庆到西安，我们来订一张票，订一张过几天的票。
What does it say?
然后就显示那个出票失败，说我已经被法院依法限制高消费。限制乘坐 G 字头列车。
It's reserved for members of our Prime Flight program. You got to be a 4.2 or over to qualify.
Oh, I'm a 4.2.
I'm afraid you're actually a 4.18.
The entire system is overseen by over 400 million surveillance cameras with physical tracking software, which is evolving into real-time geolocation tracking of citizens via their cell phone.
Cameras record them going through intersections, zero in on their face, and then publicly shame them on nearby video screens.
So China now had full control of its economy and population. But this wasn't enough. If China wanted world domination, they would need to control entire countries. But if China wanted world domination, they would need to control entire countries. How else do you get 50% of the world's oil needed for supporting your own population? And even more importantly, how do you keep your economy going when companies start to catch on to your predatory actions? The only answer was colonization. You see, back in the early days of China plotting its vengeance, Mao Zedong spent his life mapping out the blueprint for China conquering the world. Mao claimed, the way to world conquest lies through Havana, Accra, and Calcutta. So then the real question is, how do you colonize in the 21st century without raising some suspicions? Well, you have to hide it behind the mask of neoliberalism, hand out irresistible loans to poverty-stricken countries in return for government control. Also, that colonization could be hidden through a complex web of legal terms, and so shortly after, China overtook the US as Africa's largest trading partner, with China loaning $95.5 billion to the African continent from 2000 to 2015 alone. However, you may ask, what if these countries can't pay back the loan? Won't that ruin China's profits? Well, China already knows they won't, and they're happy for them to not, because in exchange for paying back the loans through money, they can just pay it back through political control, bribe officials with loans, and China could take over each African nation one by one. And this has given China these huge alliances with the African continent, all while snapping up everything it owns. And I mean everything. Land, food, energy, natural resources, infrastructure, governments, people, and entire cultures. You will see Chinese writing everywhere. You'll see Chinese ports in Kenya, Chinese railways in Angola, and Chinese hydroelectric dams in Ethiopia. They are scouring the length and breadth of the whole of Africa for minerals and precious metals. This is why Chinese companies and workers are spread across the entire continent, and slowly China's military is following. And so soon enough, Africa found itself under modern colonial rule, and the rest of the world didn't blink an eye. But China was still a long way off from world domination. Whilst China's economy was now primed to take over the world, there were two things stopping China's takeover: culture and the military. China still didn't have the capacity to win a third world war, but China could win a psychological war. To win, they'd need to both control the flow of information around the world and then divide the nations they wanted to conquer. And this is where America has had the upper hand for decades. As I'm sure you know, American culture is spread across the entire world, and because of this, the majority of people have always been kind of reluctant to bow down to the command of communist regimes when they're soaked in a culture prioritizing individualism. Through America's spread of culture and ideology, America has been able to maintain its global influence. So how would China spread its influence? Well, where does the world get most of its information from? Social media. China realized that to control the global population, you had to control social media and what people see. So China would start by buying huge shares in social media sites like Reddit and getting YouTube stars like 𝗶𝗫 Baker to be an exclusively Chinese social media star.
That song is awesome, but check this style out.
See, in many of his skits, Baker is portrayed as a confused foreigner who often proclaims his love for everything Chinese.
But a better idea was to build a social media site to extract Western data back to the Chinese government, ruin the attention span of the younger generations, and spread Chinese propaganda and influence. And so, TikTok was born, a site used to take over the social media game, getting more downloads in recent years than Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. It has gained a foothold in the psyche of tomorrow's young adults, and yet, TikTok's design is intentionally damaging. TikTok gets you stuck on these loops of attention span destroying clicks, all whilst giving you these subtle cultural messages like banning footage of Hong Kong protests, banning Tiananmen Square posts, and banning anything pro-Tibet. And whilst you find yourself getting addicted to this app, you'll ignore TikTok's privacy page, admitting to collecting as much data as possible from metadata, GPS location, and putting all your contact information from your Facebook, Instagram, and phone.
And what kind of data is TikTok collecting as it runs on our phones? A heck of a lot more than you would think. Images, of course, that users post, but TikTok also collects information about the messages that you send, about the apps that you use, the other apps on your phone. It collects the sites that you visit. It collects your search history. It collects your keystrokes. It collects your location data. It stores all of this and maybe lots more. And I can tell you, as the father of two small children who already have many of their friends on social media, even though they're quite young, I find this absolutely horrifying, and we know that it's a national security risk. Since our last hearing on this subject, the Pentagon, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, and the TSA have all banned their employees and service members from using TikTok on government devices. In fact, the Pentagon even went so far as to say that employees should have their children uninstall TikTok from their personal devices.
This is exactly why the Indian government said that their decision to ban the app was to protect the data and privacy of its 1.3 billion citizens and put a stop to technology that was, quote, stealing and transmitting users' data in an unauthorized manner to servers outside of India, which is why TikTok is labeled as a threat to national security by the US government. But guess what? No one cares. Hardly anyone using it even knows this stuff. Schools, parents, influencers, celebrities, and even the BBC continue to promote it. And so we play straight into China's hands, because China knows that we're a populace so desensitized, so numbed on social media, porn, booze, pot and pills, that for us to feel anything, we have to go to the most instant sources of gratification possible. But China didn't just stop at social media. China would start influencing movies, TV, news, media, and even schools and professors, literally every cultural institution you can think of. And here's how they did it. So China's a huge market for Western companies, with its 1.4 billion population. That equates to a ton of money, and so movie companies want to be sure to tap into this Chinese market. And with China's limited movie output, it means Western companies like Disney will have little competition. But there's a catch. China only allows 34 foreign films to be shown in the country annually. So not only is the competition huge amongst American movie companies, it's even fiercer when factoring all the movie companies around the world that want to tap into the Chinese market. And so for your movie to be chosen for screening, you have to make sure it's absolutely squeaky clean for the Chinese censors. Which means removing any negative depictions of China, but it also means you have to praise China. You have to be as non-threatening as possible, which is why movies such as Red Dawn would edit their films to remove any negative depictions of China, removing Chinese flags and replacing them with North Korean ones. And this is happening more and more in Hollywood, where they change the scripts and plotlines for these exact reasons so that they don't offend China. Like that time when Disney remade Mulan, where one of the lead actors in the film was straight up from Chinese high society, and of course, she happened to be a big supporter of the CCP's crackdown of Hong Kong protesters. And let's not forget that at the end of the film, Disney literally thanked 8 different Chinese government departments in Xingjang who are directly involved in the Uyghurs genocide. And then there's sports, like that time when basketball fans were kicked out of a pre-season game because they brought signs that read "Free Hong Kong." Chinese communist money is more important to the NBA than allowing fans, coaches, or God forbid players to support democracy in Hong Kong.
Free Hong Kong! We will not bow to communist Chinese oppression! Freedom of speech! Free Hong Kong!
You all are saying you don't want to take a side about concentration camps for Chinese.
Okay, I'm not going back and forth with you. It's held you specifically, I'm not allowed.
We're not allowed to hold my Google Uyghur sign.
Thank you. Enjoy the game. Good luck. Enjoy the game. Thank you. Thank you.
Or like when NBA players were forced to say that they love China and everything it stands for.
Yeah, we apologize. We love China. We love playing there. We love everything they're about, and we appreciate their support that they give us individually and as an organization. So we love you.
And then the communist Chinese government-run newspaper The People's Daily complained about a video game in the Apple App Store. It was an app that protesters were using to coordinate their protests in Hong Kong. So Apple caved and pulled it from the App Store. Then in the gaming sphere, Blizzard Entertainment pulled one of their players and took his $10,000 prize money from one of the tournaments after he voiced support for the demonstrators in Hong Kong. Then Marriott Hotels fired an employee because he liked a tweet that supported independence for Tibet, because that offends China. Other instances include Mercedes-Benz, who apologized to China after they quoted the Dalai Lama on Instagram. American Airlines and Delta are deleting any mention that Taiwan is its own country after China got upset with them. And I have a feeling we're going to be learning about many, many more, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. China has relentlessly gone to war with Western culture, not only through media, TV, and businesses, but also through schools and colleges. Professors around America have been caught selling secret research to the Chinese. The media never covers it, so here's a list of those who have been caught so far. This UCLA professor was caught selling Air Force Navy missile secrets to the Chinese. He's now facing 219 years in prison. The head of the chemistry department at Harvard was caught secretly taking $1.5 million from the Chinese to set up a medical research lab in Wuhan. In addition, he was paid up to $50,000 a month for other research he smuggled to the Chinese. This professor from the University of Kansas had 2 research contracts with the Department of Energy. Turns out, he was also secretly working for the Chinese, smuggling research to them all along. He now faces 50 years in prison. This guy was caught trying to smuggle 21 vials of cancer research from a Harvard medical lab to the Chinese government. He now faces 30 years in prison. This professor from the world-renowned Cleveland Clinic was secretly giving information to the Chinese whilst receiving $3.6 million in taxpayer funding for his research. This professor in Georgia was fired after it was discovered that he tried to cover up money he'd been paid by the Chinese government while conducting research with the National Institute of Health. This professor was applying for a federal research grant from NASA when an investigation showed he was also simultaneously receiving payments from the Chinese government. I'm sure that was just an accident. And so that brings up the question, why do 75 American colleges have Communist Party-funded Confucius Institutes on campus? The Pentagon says they're national security threats, and even China admits they're propaganda centers. There was a recent investigation that just found 48 colleges broke the law in failing to report tens of millions in donations from China. There is endless evidence of foreign interference on campuses, and this is never reported. And people on campus are afraid to question China for fear of being labelled xenophobic or racist. Colleges are so concerned about being called intolerant that they literally let a communist regime exploit the country. And it's just worked incredibly for China, because now in the UK not only have 500 Chinese military scientists spent time at British universities in the past decade, working on technologies linked to missiles, supercomputers and jet aircraft, but GCHQ has warned universities about hostile state actors trying to steal personal data, research data and intellectual property. And it gets so much worse. We're also learning that the Communist Party has serious financial interests in British schools. Hundreds of independent schools left in dire financial straits by the pandemic are being targeted by Chinese investors. 17 schools are already owned by Chinese companies, but that number is set to rocket. And investigations have found that these schools are using educational tools for teaching children a whitewashed view of China. One Chinese firm admitted its acquisition of British schools is aimed at supporting China's controversial Belt Road Initiative. And nobody knows how far this will go, and so many will say that it's better to prop up such institutions with Chinese money than see them close, but that ignores the much more important issue. The West is seeing a communist takeover of the education sector. That is serious, and so with China's fingers in so many cultural pies, the only hole left to fill was the political front. So China is already getting all the data they need on the population, but if they can know what their political opponent is going to do next, they can steer their opponent in the direction that they want them to go in. China could basically control the future without ever firing a bullet. So the question was, how would China get said intel and influence? Women.
This woman, Christine Fang, a Chinese national, was a student at Cal State East Bay and president of the Chinese Student Association. The FBI says she was also a spy who was trying to cozy up to Bay Area politicians, the mayor of Fremont, volunteering for Ro Khanna's campaign, and even a young Congressman Eric Swalwell. San Jose State professor Dr. 𝗘𝗾𝗂𝗶𝗽𝗺𝗺 says this form of spycraft is common.
China could get all the intel they need in the form of pillow talk gossip and having easy access to politicians' phones and laptops. Over the long term, this has gotten China's officials directly tied with politicians who will get big and powerful. After all, today's mayors and city council members are tomorrow's governors, congressmen and senators. Which is why the infamous Christine Fang would target local politicians who are up and coming and who are going to be the next stars and make it to the national level. And one of our biggest targets was Eric Swalwell, a politician that rose to prominence as one of the youngest members of Congress, and a guy who also ran for the 2020 election. As a member of Congress, he was assigned a seat on the subcommittee for CIA oversight within the Committee on Intelligence. So Christine Fang bagged him while Eric was just a city council member in California. This is just one of the many examples of how far China is willing to go to influence US politics. Potential targets could also be aides, staffers and interns, those that are close to the source of power that are more vulnerable and naive. The CIA said there could be thousands of these Chinese agents in America. In the UK, after the story broke, they said it's almost a certainty that China has numerous spies operating in the UK. And in 2011, France also warned that China was using beautiful female spies to steal their state secrets. China is inching towards world domination. China is winning the economic and psychological war. China has control of global populations and certain intergovernmental organizations, but the one thing China was lacking? A military. Or just not one as big as America's. Now by this point the military isn't even that essential once you've controlled the world economically and psychologically, but it's still needed, which is why China has gained the largest navy in the world. Because the next physical conflict is going to be in the South China Sea. And so through China's huge amount of intel, they could then predict what their political opponents were going to do next. The US Navy said they had seen an expansion of Chinese activity in recent months, with Chinese military activity in the South China Sea rising steadily. According to the Navy, China is conducting routine naval patrols during US joint exercises, and their increased naval presence in the area has made it the most visible staging ground for open military competition between China and the US. And they're doing all of this to conquer Taiwan just like they did with Hong Kong.
Look at it.
On Friday, Chinese forces committed their largest ever incursion into Taiwanese airspace, as worries grow by the day of a Chinese invasion of the Democratic Island Republic. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Iran is on the march, with its rebel militias now attacking Saudi oil fields and building up a stockpile of missiles that has Israeli planners increasingly nervous about a potentially devastating conflict happening sooner rather than later.
And so with all of this happening and war brewing, the Pentagon uses more and more irrelevant criteria in hiring and promoting in order to meet the various demands of democratic interest groups. The Pentagon has dramatically lowered standards in the services.
Where we're making good progress designing body armor that fits women properly, tailoring combat uniforms for women, creating maternity flight suits, updating requirements for their hairstyles.
Why are they doing this? If China moves against Taiwan or Malaysia, that would be a grave concern to the world. Because how exactly would the US even respond? And more likely, if the Chinese decided to close international shipping lanes with the Belt Road Initiative, it would close our economy. If they decide to shut down our internet, it would bring our life to a halt. Which brings up the question, can the US military still win a real war? There is no strategy. Eric Swalwell is still on the Intelligence Committee. TikTok continues to grow in popularity. China's economy continues to soar. Uyghur Muslims continue to be persecuted. Schools and universities continue to sell out to China. The media continues to sell out to China. The politicians continue to sell out to China. And the public was too busy caring about identity politics and their own immediate dopamine-seeking behavior that we were too ignorant to see what was happening below our noses. But then again, where would most learn about any of this? Especially when no one can report this from China, and no one can even report this in the West without losing their career and funding. Which is why China's plans for world domination is manifesting as I speak. The digital manipulation, the Belt and Road Initiative, the colonization, buying schools, these are all thin veneers and facades for which China is trying to supplant the United States as the world's superpower. If we continue to follow this path of least resistance, if we don't snap out of this trance we were in, if we don't come up with a strategy, if we don't address the scale of economic and psychological warfare being directed at each and every one of us, then I fear deeply that we are reaching the 250-year mark.